The disciplinary tribunal of the Vetian Civilian Peace Conference convened at 0800 station time on the morning of the 6th day, and the first order of business was whether the defendant would be permitted to sit. That was the word they used, permitted, as though a chair were a privilege extended by the conference to those it chose to hear, rather than a piece of furniture bolted to the floor of Tribunal Chamber 9. The presiding arbiter, a Tvrathi elder named Chelon, raised the question in the procedural voice that Tvrathi administrators used when they wished to communicate that a matter had already been decided, and the discussion was a courtesy. His smooth gray skin caught the chamber's ambient light, his deep-set eyes fixed on a point above the defendant's head, as though addressing the architecture rather than the man standing below the bench. The conference notes that the defendant has been charged under Article 7 of the Vetian, accord with disruption of plenary proceedings, incitement of cross-delegation hostility, and conduct prejudicial to the peace process. The conference further notes that the defendant's status as a seated delegate was suspended upon the filing of these charges. The tribunal will hear argument on whether standing privileges should be extended during proceedings. Standing privileges: the right to remain upright in a room full of people who were already seated. The Tvrathi had a gift for making humiliation sound procedural. The defendant was a human male named Comruk, 47 years old, broad shoulders, weathered face, close-cropped gray-black hair, the kind of build that suggested a life spent carrying things heavier than briefcases. He wore a dark charcoal suit that fit him well enough to be deliberate and poorly enough to be honest, the jacket slightly too tight across the shoulders, the collar a fraction too high, the kind of suit a man buys when he has one occasion to wear it and does not expect another. His hands were clasped behind his back. His expression was neutral in the way that stone is neutral, not performing calm, simply present. He had been standing for 40 minutes already. The tribunal had begun its procedural review without acknowledging him, working through 7 preliminary motions while he waited at the defendant's rail, a curved bar of polished dark alloy that came to his waist, positioned at the center of the chamber floor like a dock in an old courtroom, surrounded on 3 sides by rising tiers of observer seating filled with delegates, staffers, and correspondents from 11 species. The rail had no seat attached to it. It had been designed, centuries ago, for species whose physiology did not require sitting. Nobody had thought to redesign it. Nobody had needed to. Until now, the defendant's rail had only ever held people the conference wanted to see standing. Rurk had not requested a chair. He had not protested the 40-minute wait. He had not shifted his weight, adjusted his jacket, checked a terminal, or glanced at the observer tiers, behaviors that a Tvrathi behavioral analyst might have cataloged as signs of discomfort, and that Rurk's absence of them made conspicuous. He simply stood, the way a man stands who has spent 2 decades in rooms where people were deciding his clients' futures, and had learned that the first person to fidget was the first person the room stopped taking seriously. The 7 arbiters at the bench had been trained, over centuries of institutional practice, to read defendants' posture for submission, anxiety, and procedural deference. Rurk's posture offered none of these. It offered only stillness, and the bench did not know how to read stillness from a human, because in the conference's institutional experience, humans had not been still. They had been accommodating, agreeable, eager to demonstrate their value as junior members of the interspecies community. They had been grateful. Rurk was not grateful. He was standing, which was a different thing entirely. I am recording this account from the observation gallery, because the conference's official transcript was sealed by the arbiter's office within hours of the proceedings' conclusion, and because the sealed version omits material that I, as the Terran delegation's military attaché, am obligated to preserve in the delegation's independent record. What follows is my reconstruction, assembled from personal notes, the delegation's internal log, and the recollections of 3 colleagues who were present in the chamber. I have been as precise as memory permits. Where I have been imprecise, The imprecision favors the conference, not us. The Veshan Civilian Peace Conference occupied an orbital station above the planet Veshan, a temperate world chosen as the site for interspecies peace negotiations, because it was claimed by none of the 14 signatory species, and desired by none of them either a diplomatic virtue that the Tavrathi, who had designed the conference's charter, considered essential, and that the rest of us considered honest. The station was elegant in the way that intergovernmental facilities are elegant. Soaring corridors of pale composite and brushed alloy, glass domes admitting broad panels of daylight from the Veshan sun, holographic schedule boards glowing cyan along every wall, committee rooms designed to seat 200 in tiered semicircles that made every speaker feel observed and every observer feel important. 1,200 staff, 46 permanent committees. A plenary hall that seated 3,000 under a dome, so precisely engineered that the acoustics carried a whisper from the floor to the uppermost tier, without amplification. The conference's stated purpose was the maintenance of interspecies peace through dialogue, arbitration, and the structured resolution of disputes. Its actual purpose, as far as I could determine after 9 years as the Terran delegation's military attaché, was the maintenance of the conference itself, the perpetuation of procedures, the scheduling of sessions, the issuance of communiques that described progress in terms so carefully constructed that they could not be distinguished from stasis. It functioned. It was funded. It employed 1,200 people. It had not resolved a substantive dispute in 6 years. Nobody mentioned this. The 1,200 employees were, by and large, people who had been selected for their ability to not mention things. My name is Major Lena Adami, and I have served as the Terran delegation's military attaché to the conference for 9 years, long enough to understand the institution's rhythms, its reflexes, and its particular talent for absorbing inconvenient realities into procedural language, until they cease to exist as anything other than line items in an assessment report. I had watched 4 human delegates rotate through the conference during my posting. Each had arrived with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Each had departed with varying degrees of professional exhaustion. None had changed anything. They had attended sessions, filed reports, smiled at the right moments, and contributed to the conference's ability to describe itself as inclusive of humanity without actually including humanity in anything that mattered. The posting was considered a tour of duty in the diplomatic service's most comfortable irrelevance, a place where you could not fail because nothing you did would be permitted to succeed. Comwork had arrived 14 months earlier as Earth's civilian delegate to the subcommittee on resource allocation disputes, replacing a career diplomat who had retired after 8 years of attending meetings that produced reports that recommended further meetings. Rourke was not a diplomat. He had been a municipal labor mediator in Cork for 22 years, a man who had spent his career sitting in rooms with people who hated each other and finding the sentence that made them stop. He had been appointed because the Terran Diplomatic Service had exhausted its list of volunteers for the Veshan posting. The assignment was considered a career stall, a place where ambition went to be processed and filed. And because someone in the personnel office had read his file and decided that a man who had mediated dockworkers' strikes and housing disputes and fishery quota negotiations might survive a conference committee without losing his mind or his sense of humor, though the latter was not listed as a qualification. He had survived. He had done considerably more than survive. In 14 months, Rourke had done something the conference's institutional memory could not process. He had resolved 3 disputes, actual disputes, not managed them, not referred them, not produced an interim assessment recommending a revised timeline for a reassessment of a preliminary framework for a future consultation on potential terms of reference for an eventual resolution. He had resolved them. Cases that had been cycling through the subcommittee's docket for years, referred and re-referred and tabled and reopened and referred again, in the conference's perpetual procedural respiration. Each case, accumulating committee minutes and assessment documents and preliminary findings that piled up like geological strata over a fossil that everyone had forgotten was there. Rourke had read the files, every file, including the annexes nobody read, because the annexes were where the actual grievances had been procedurally buried beneath the procedural responses to the procedural objections to the original procedural filings, identified the real points of contention, and proposed settlements so plain-spoken that the parties had agreed to them before the committee secretariat could draft the standard referral motion. The Keith Ronnie Desari water rights case, dormant for 4 years, settled in 3 sessions. Rourke had spent the first session listening. Not performing listening, not nodding at the appropriate moments while preparing his next statement, not making eye contact to signal engagement while mentally drafting his response, but actually listening, the way a labor mediator listens, with his whole weight in the chair and his eyes on the person speaking, and his mouth shut until the person had said everything they needed to say, including the things they had not planned to say and the things they did not know they needed to say until they heard themselves saying them. The Keith Ronnie delegate, an elder named Sathan who had been reciting the same procedural brief for 4 years to increasingly empty rooms, had spoken for 40 minutes without interruption. When she finished, Rourke had asked one question: is the water the problem or is the survey boundary the problem? Sathan had blinked the slow, deliberate Keith Ronnie blink that signified genuine surprise and said, the boundary. The dispute was about water rights. The grievance was about a survey line drawn 60 years ago by a committee that no longer existed, using methodology that both parties now considered flawed, for reasons that had nothing to do with water and everything to do with a mineral rights precedent that neither delegation wanted to reopen. Rourke proposed resurveying the boundary with both parties present. The Desari agreed in the same session. The Keith Ronnie agreed the following week. The case was closed. The Tvrathavethon mining access dispute, active for 6 years and documented across 9,000 pages of committee records, settled in 5 sessions. Rourke had read all 9,000 pages. He later told me this was the longest he had ever spent reading anything, including the collected works of every Irish labor arbitrator since the founding of the state, a body of literature he had consumed during a 3-month recovery from a broken leg, sustained while refereeing a football match in Cobb. The mining dispute's core issue, buried beneath the procedural accretion, was a disagreement about safety standards that both parties actually agreed on but could not acknowledge agreeing on because the committee's terms of reference required the dispute to be framed as a resource access question, and the safety standards fell outside the committee's jurisdiction. Rourke proposed reframing the case as a joint safety assessment, which moved it to a different committee where both parties' existing positions were compatible. The case was closed in the 5th session, and the safety standards were adopted within a month. The Orestian Cultural Heritage Claim, which had generated 11,000 pages of documentation and 0 resolution over 8 years, settled in 2 sessions, and a private conversation that Rourke conducted in a corridor outside the committee room because, as he told me afterward, the room had too many chairs for people who were not going to sit down, and not enough air for people who needed to breathe. I watched the Orestian settlement from the corridor, standing 6 meters away while Rourke sat on a bench with the Orestian delegation chief, a small figure with luminous silver-white skin and large, dark eyes that reflected light in a way that made it difficult to tell whether she was looking at you or at something behind you. The conversation lasted 18 minutes. When it ended, the Orestian chief stood, placed both hands flat on the corridor wall, a gesture I later learned was an Orestian expression of structural agreement, of a thing fitting into its correct place, and walked back into the committee room to sign the document that 8 years of procedural deliberation had failed to produce. Rourke remained on the bench for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, then stood up and told me he was going to get a cup of tea because his throat was dry from listening. That was Rourke. The work was listening, The resolution was what happened when the listening was done correctly. The T was the thing that came after. The settlements held, the parties complied, the disputes were resolved. And the conference, which had built its institutional identity around the management of unresolved disputes, the way a hospital might build its identity around the management of chronic illness rather than the pursuit of cure, discovered that resolution was not a product it was equipped to process. A resolved dispute did not require a follow-up committee. It did not generate assessment reports. It did not justify the continuation of a subcommittee's budget cycle or the employment of the staff who administered that cycle. It simply ended, and the silence it left behind was the kind of silence that institutions find deeply uncomfortable, because silence cannot be scheduled, cannot be assessed, and does not appear on the quarterly activity report. Rourke did not understand this. Or rather, he understood it precisely and continued working regardless, which in institutional terms amounted to a provocation more severe than any explicit challenge could have been. He attended subcommittee sessions. He read files. He proposed settlements. He listened to delegates who had not been listened to in years, asked the question that the procedural framework had been designed to avoid asking, and reached agreements that the parties signed because they wanted to, not because the timeline had expired, and the alternative was another 4 years of committee minutes. And the conference's immune system activated. The activation was not dramatic. It was procedural, the most dangerous kind, because procedural actions carried the weight of legitimacy and the appearance of routine. A motion to review the subcommittee's terms of reference. A request for an assessment of whether recent settlements had followed proper arbitration protocol. A quiet reclassification of one of Rourke's settled cases from resolved to provisionally concluded pending review. A status that existed in the conference's procedural lexicon, but had never been applied to a case both parties had signed off on. A briefing document, unsigned and undated, formatted in the conference's standard analytical template, circulated among senior delegation staff, describing recent settlements as procedurally irregular and potentially destabilizing to the conference's arbitration framework. The document did not name Rourke. It did not need to. Everyone who read it understood who had produced the irregular settlements. The phrase procedural adventurism, which appeared nowhere in the conference's charter or procedural manual, began appearing in committee reports and floor speeches with the sudden ubiquity of a term that had been agreed upon before it was coined. Small adjustments, institutional corrections, the bureaucratic equivalent of an organism identifying a foreign body and beginning to encapsulate it. The charges came 6 weeks before the tribunal. 3 charges, each calibrated to sound serious without being specific. Disruption of plenary proceedings. Rourke had spoken during a plenary session without being recognized by the presiding chair, an infraction that the procedural manual classified as a Category 3 minor breach, and that no delegate had been referred to tribunal for in the conference's entire history. Incitement of cross-delegation hostility. Rourke had proposed that the Dissari and Keithrani delegations negotiate directly rather than through the committee's mediation framework, a suggestion the committee chair, a Tavrathi named Prathon, had described as a fundamental misunderstanding of the conference's role. Conduct prejudicial to the peace process, a catch-all charge that required no specific act and admitted no specific defense, the procedural equivalent of charging someone with being inconvenient. The charges were filed by the arbiter's office, which reported to the senior coordinating committee, which was chaired by Prathon, who had been the subcommittee chair whose mediation framework Rourke had bypassed. The circularity was visible to anyone who looked. Most delegates did not look. The conference was a system that rewarded not looking, and the delegates were, by and large, people who had been rewarded. The 3 settled disputes were reopened for procedural review. Review committees were formed, 3 of them, one per case, each staffed by arbiters appointed by the senior coordinating committee, each tasked with assessing whether the settlements had followed established procedural norms. The committee's terms of reference did not define established procedural norms. They did not need to. The committees existed to produce doubt, not conclusions. Their function was atmospheric, to suggest, through the weight of institutional process, that the settlements were somehow provisional, uncertain, built on foundations that proper scrutiny might reveal to be sand. The social isolation was precise. Rourke's name disappeared from the informal delegation roster. His access to the delegates' dining facility was revoked through an administrative adjustment so minor that no specific order could be cited as its cause. His reservation was simply not renewed when the quarterly roster was updated, and the update happened to coincide, by administrative coincidence, with the filing of the charges. His mail routing was modified to introduce a 4-hour delay on incoming correspondence, which was within the Secretariat's standard administrative discretion for personnel under review. His terminal access to the conference's internal communication network was restricted to outgoing messages only he could send, but the system would not notify him of incoming responses until the next business day. These were small things. Each one, individually, could be explained as a standard administrative procedure applied routinely. Together, they constituted a systematic reduction of a delegate's ability to function as a delegate, executed entirely within the rules. Rourke's delegation status was suspended. His committee access was revoked. His communication privileges were restricted. His name was quietly removed from the informal delegation roster that determined seating assignments, reception invitations, and dining facility access. He ate in his quarters. He did not mention it. He spent those first evenings in the delegation's common room, reading the conference's charter from beginning to end, all 411 articles, plus the 73 amendments, plus the 14 interpretive annexes that had been appended over the centuries by various arbitration panels and that most delegates treated as decorative. Rourke read them the way he read everything, completely, methodically, with a pencil in his hand and a notebook on the table beside his tea. He filled 2 notebooks in the first week. He did not tell me what he was writing. I did not ask. I had learned over 14 months that asking Rourke what he was doing before he was ready to explain it was the conversational equivalent of opening an oven door mid-bake. The result would be the same, but the timing would be wrong, and Rourke cared about timing the way a stonemason cared about load-bearing walls. I was there when he received the charge notice, delivered to his quarters at 06:00 on the first day. I heard his door open at 06:02 and close at 06:03. I knocked. He opened the door holding the notice in one hand and a cup of tea in the other, the tea still steaming, the notice already read. "They've charged me," he said. His voice was the same as it always was, steady, unhurried, the cadence of a man who had spent 2 decades listening to people shout, and had learned that the useful information came after the shouting stopped. "With what?" "Being good at the job, near as I can tell. 3 charges, 2 minor, 1 elastic enough to mean whatever the arbiter wants it to mean." He handed me the notice. I read it in his doorway. "You need counsel." "I'll represent myself. I've read their procedural manual, all 312 pages. Self-representation is a charter right they can't waive without a full committee vote, which they won't call because it would require publishing the charges to the full plenary before the tribunal. Last thing they want." "What do you need from me?" "Be in the room. Write it down." That was 14 months of acquaintance compressed into 5 words. Rourke never asked for more than he needed, and he never needed more than a witness. I should note here, for the record, what Rourke did not do during the 6 weeks between the charges and the tribunal. He did not contact the press. 3 independent correspondents covered conference affairs from bureau offices on the station, and any one of them would have found the story irresistible. A civilian mediator, charged with being too effective, settled disputes being reopened over the party's objections. A committee chair prosecuting the delegate who had exposed his committee's irrelevance. The story wrote itself. But press attention without institutional process would produce outrage, not correction. The charges would remain on the record. The review committees would continue their work. The conference's procedural machinery would absorb the publicity the way it absorbed everything, through committees, referrals, assessments, and the gradual, patient conversion of urgency into administrative routine. Rourke understood this. He had watched institutions digest scandals before, in Cork, in Dublin, in Brussels. The digestion always followed the same sequence: alarm, committee, report, implementation timeline, quiet burial. He was not going to feed the machine. He did not contact his home government. The Terran diplomatic service had channels for escalation: formal protest, diplomatic note, recalled ambassador. Any of these would have elevated the dispute from a conference internal matter to an interspecies incident. And interspecies incidents at the conference were managed by the senior coordinating committee, which was chaired by Prothon, which meant the escalation would circle back to the person who had filed the charges. Rourke was not interested in escalation. He was interested in the room. He did not lobby delegates. He did not circulate counter-documents. He did not organize a defense committee or solicit character witnesses or draft a statement of principles. He read the archive. He read the charter. He filled notebooks. He drank tea. He waited. The 6 weeks before the tribunal were an education in institutional choreography. The conference did not merely prepare a case. It prepared an atmosphere. Rourke's 3 settled disputes were reopened for procedural review. Review committees were formed. Assessment timelines were established. The Keith Ronnie and Dissari delegations, who had signed the water rights settlement and considered the matter closed, were notified that the settlement status had been changed to under review, and that compliance was recommended but not required, pending the review's conclusion. The Dissari responded with a formal protest. The Keith Ronnie responded with silence, which was the Keith Ronnie way of protesting, and which the conference had learned, over centuries of interspecies relations, to take more seriously than any written objection. The reputational campaign was methodical. The unsigned briefing document was cited in 3 committee reports and 1 plenary floor speech. A Tavrathi delegate used the phrase procedural adventurism. An analytical piece in the conference's internal journal described the subcommittee's recent activity as a deviation from established norms that warrants institutional attention. A second unsigned document suggested that Rourke's settlements, while superficially effective, had created dependency on individual initiative rather than systemic process, which was the most bureaucratically elegant way of saying, "He did the thing we were supposed to do that I had ever encountered." Rourke watched all of it. He read every document that reached him through channels I will not describe. He attended no meetings because his access had been revoked. He spent his days in the delegation's small common room, reading the conference's historical archive, the full record of every tribunal, every disciplinary action, every procedural dispute adjudicated since the founding. I found him at 23:00 one night in the 4th week, surrounded by holographic archive displays, 6 committee transcripts open simultaneously. "What are you looking for?" "Precedent," he said, "and something else. Every institution builds the tools to correct itself into its own foundation. The designers always assume the tools will be needed someday. The administrators always assume they won't be. The question is whether anyone remembers they're there when the day comes." On the 29th day, he found what he was looking for. He did not tell me what it was. He closed his displays, stretched his shoulders, and said, "I need you to request the tribunal's observer manifest." The manifest was public, 200 seats. I delivered it the next morning. Rourke studied it for an hour. Then he asked me to send one message through the delegation's official channel to every delegation that had been party to one of the 3 settled disputes. The message was short. It did not reference the tribunal. It did not ask for support. It said, "The Terran delegation confirms that the settlements reached in cases 4471, 4472, and 4473 remain, from our perspective, final and binding. We consider the matters resolved." 14 delegations received it. None replied formally. But over the next 3 days, the Observer Manifest's Interested Parties section filled. Keithrani representatives, Disari trade officials, Oreshan cultural attachés, people who had been in the rooms where Rourke had done the work, who had watched him listen and ask the question that cut through procedure to the actual problem, who had signed agreements they intended to honor regardless of what the conference's review committees decided. None of the 14 delegations asked what the message meant. They understood. In the conference's diplomatic language, a formal confirmation of a settlement's binding status was a statement of position. It declared, without the indelicacy of saying so directly, that the Terran delegation considered the settlements legitimate and the review process illegitimate, and that it intended to maintain this position regardless of the tribunal's outcome. In ordinary circumstances, such a message would have been noted and filed. In these circumstances, with the tribunal 4 days away and the Observer Manifest public, it was a signal, a quiet, procedurally correct signal, that the parties to the settlements were welcome to attend if they wished to see what the conference intended to do with the agreements they had signed in good faith. They wished. The tribunal opened on the 6th day. I was in the observation gallery, upper tier, clear sightline to the floor. I had arrived at the gallery at 07:30, 30 minutes before the session was scheduled to open. The chamber was already half full. Delegates and staffers had come early, an unusual occurrence for conference proceedings, which typically began with rows of empty seats that filled gradually as the morning's committee schedule released people into the corridors. This morning, the seats were filling in the opposite direction from the back rows forward, which meant the first arrivals were the people who wanted to be furthest from the bench and closest to the exits, the people who had come to observe without being observed, the institutional wildlife that appears when an institution senses that something is about to happen that it did not schedule and cannot control. Tribunal Chamber 9 was built in the conference's standard hearing configuration, an elevated bench of pale composite seating 7 arbiters in a curved row, Chelon at the center in charcoal robes with silver thread at the shoulders. Behind the bench, a glass dome admitted the full morning light of the Veshan sun, bright, warm, falling in broad shafts that pooled on the pale stone floor and caught the polished surfaces of the bench. Through the dome, the sky was clear pale blue, and 3 Terran escort vessels held quiet formation at the orbital perimeter, their dark angular hulls motionless against the bright atmosphere. They were not close. They were visible. Nobody at the bench mentioned them. The observer tiers were full. 212 people, 12 over capacity, the overflow standing along the back wall. The Keithrani delegation had sent 9 representatives. The Disari had sent 7, including their senior trade commissioner, a towering figure whose 4 bronze arms were folded in the posture of formal witness. The Oreshan cultural attaché sat in the second row, iridescent scales catching the dome light. 3 independent press correspondents wore recording badges. In the back row, 2 retired Tavrathi arbiters sat side by side, watching the bench with the patience of people who had spent careers applying rules and intended to notice if they were not. Rourke stood at the rail, hands clasped behind his back, charcoal suit, no insignia, no documents, no display terminal. His face was angled slightly upward toward the bench, not in supplication, but in the manner of someone examining the source of a sound he intended to identify. The first charge was read: disruption of plenary proceedings. The prosecution, a young Tvrathi legal officer named Resik, precise, compressed, carrying institutional certainty in every gesture, presented the case. Rourke had spoken without being recognized. The session record confirmed the infraction. The referral cited exceptional circumstances, specifically that 3 delegations had requested a recess following the interjection. Rourke was invited to respond. "What did I say?" he asked. Resik blinked. The question was not in his prepared sequence. "I beg your pardon." "When I spoke without being recognized." "What were the words?" Resik consulted his terminal. "The session record indicates that you said, and I quote, 'Has anyone asked the Keithrani what they actually need?'" A sound moved through the observer tiers. Not laughter, something quieter and more corrosive. The sound of 200 people processing a sentence and finding it insufficient to carry the weight of a tribunal charge. "And the 3 delegations that requested a recess," Rourke continued. "Was the Keithrani delegation among them?" "Yes." "And when the session resumed, did the Keithrani present a revised resource request?" "They did." "Was that request incorporated into the final allocation framework?" A pause. "It was." "And was the Keithrani delegation's satisfaction noted in the closing summary?" "I would need to verify." Page 47, third paragraph. "The Keithrani delegation expressed appreciation for the revised framework and confirmed compliance with all allocation terms." I have the passage memorized because it was the first time in the conference's session record that the Keithrani expressed appreciation for anything. The Keithrani representatives in the observer tiers did not move. They did not need to. Their presence was the response. Chelon's gray hands shifted on the bench. "The tribunal notes the defendant's response. Proceed to the second charge." The second charge consumed an hour. Incitement of cross-delegation hostility. Resik built the case with care. Rourke had suggested bilateral negotiation, bypassing the conference's mediation framework, creating conditions in which delegations might bypass conference oversight entirely, undermining institutional trust in the structured channels that had maintained interspecies dialogue for centuries. Rourke let him finish, then. "The suggestion I made was that 2 parties speak to each other. Is the conference's position that member delegations require the conference's permission to have a conversation? The mediation framework provides structured channels for." "I'm familiar with the framework. I've read the subcommittee's procedural guidelines, the mediation protocols, and 12 years of committee minutes documenting how the framework has been applied. In those 12 years, 47 disputes have entered the framework. Do you know how many have exited it with a binding resolution?" Resik was silent, not the silence of ignorance, the silence of a man who knew the answer and understood what would happen when it was said aloud. "3, Rourke said. "My 3. Before I arrived, the framework's resolution rate was 0, not low, 0 in 12 years. The chamber was quiet. Not institutional quiet, the routine hush of a body processing information. A different kind. The kind of quiet that has physical weight, that presses on the eardrums, that makes people aware of their own breathing. The framework does not resolve disputes," Rourke continued. His voice had not changed, same cadence, same steadiness. "It manages them. It keeps them active, documented, procedurally alive, circulating through committees and review cycles and assessment periods. It sustains the appearance of progress without requiring the inconvenience of a result. I am not accusing anyone of malice. I am describing the system's output. 47 in, 0 out. Those are not my numbers. Those are the committee's own records." 2 arbiters exchanged glances. The Disari arbiter at the far end shifted forward, upper arms on the bench surface, lower arms gripping its edge. The involuntary posture of engaged attention that Disari physiology produced before conscious decision caught up. The defendant will confine his remarks to the specific charge, Chelan said. The specific charge is that I told two delegations they could talk to each other. They did. They resolved a dispute that had been active for 4 years. The parties are satisfied. The settlement is signed. That is the incitement of cross-delegation hostility I am charged with. In the observer tiers, the Disari Trade Commissioner unfolded one pair of arms, a single gesture, deliberate, visible to every eye in the chamber. The senior Keithrani representative inclined her scaled head by a fraction, the Keithrani formal acknowledgement of a fact stated without embellishment. These were not spontaneous reactions. These were diplomatic communications delivered through body language, and every delegate in the room understood them as such. Chelan called a recess at 10:30. The chamber did not empty. People stayed in their seats or stood in clusters along the gallery walls, speaking in low tones of people who had expected to witness a procedural formality and were discovering they were watching something else entirely. I went to the corridor to bring Rourke water. He was standing at the observation alcove, a small window overlooking the Veshan orbital approach. The escort vessels were visible in the distance, dark shapes against the bright sky. "How are you doing?" He took the water, drank half, set it on the window ledge. "The third charge is the one that matters," he said. "The first two are scaffolding. The third is the load-bearing wall. Conduct prejudicial to the peace process. A charge that means whatever the arbiter says it means. No specific act required. No specific defense available. They built the manual's vaguest charge because they needed a tool that could fit any shape, and they're going to use it to revoke my credentials, void the settlements, and send me home. The question is whether they do it to an empty room or a full one. The room is full." He looked at me. His expression had not changed since the morning. Stone neutral, not performing calm, simply present the way a man is present who has stood in rooms where people shouted for 22 years and learned that the building does not fall down. "The room is full," he agreed. And he walked back to the chamber. When the hearing resumed at 11:00, the chamber had changed. Not the architecture, the audience. Where 212 had sat that morning, now there were close to 270. Word had moved through the station during the recess not through official channels, but through the organic communication network of staffers and junior delegates and corridor conversations that no procedural manual could regulate. People had come to watch. Additional Keithrani representatives had arrived. A senior Disari diplomat who had not been on the original manifest was seated in the third row, 4 arms folded in the posture of official observation. 2 Vethan trade observers had found standing room along the back wall. A Tavrathi journalist, not one of the 3 credentialed correspondents, but an independent commentator known for covering institutional proceedings, had taken a seat in the upper tier with a recording device on her knee. The retired Tavrathi arbiters were still in their back row seats, unmoved, their postures carrying the particular gravity of people who had been right about something for a long time and were waiting patiently to see if anyone else would notice. The third charge, conduct prejudicial to the peace process. Resick presented the argument with 12 minutes of careful, footnoted institutional prosecution. Rourke's methods, however individually effective, represented a pattern of behavior that prioritized expedience over process, resolution over procedure, bilateral engagement over the conference's multilateral framework. The cumulative effect was erosion of institutional confidence. The damage was systemic. The remedy was revocation of credentials and referral of all affected settlements for procedural review. It was the longest presentation of the day, impeccably structured, rhetorically sound, a model of institutional reasoning, and at its center, naked beneath the procedural language like a bone beneath silk, was a single argument. This man made us look unnecessary, and we would like him to stop. Chelan turned to Rourke. The defendant may respond. Rourke stood at the rail, hands behind his back. He looked at the bench. 7 arbiters looking down at him from the elevated desk. The dome above, bright morning light falling in shafts that caught the dust motes suspended in the chamber's recycled air. 270 people waiting in the tiers behind him, the largest audience a tribunal proceeding had drawn in the conference's institutional memory. He looked at the Keithrani representatives. He looked at the Disari trade commissioner. He looked at the Oreshan attaché with her recording tablet. He looked at the retired arbiters, the press correspondents, the junior delegates who had come because the corridor conversations had told them something was happening that the official schedule could not explain. Then he turned to the bench and said nothing. The silence held for 4 seconds, 5, 6, 7, long enough for the chamber to feel it, the particular weight of a man choosing not to speak in a room designed to compel speech, to extract responses, to process silence as admission. The tribunal's architecture demanded an answer. The bench was elevated for exactly this purpose. The rail was placed at its center for exactly this purpose. The 7 faces above, the curved tiers around, the dome light falling like a spotlight, all of it designed to make the person at the rail feel the building's weight and respond to it. Rourke stood in the building's weight and did not respond. "The defendant declines to respond," Chelon asked. "I have nothing to add," Rourke said. "The settlements speak for themselves. The parties are in this room. The records are public. I am a labor mediator from Cork who was asked to help people reach agreements, and I did. If that is prejudicial to the peace process, then the conference should say so clearly in open session with the parties present, and let the record reflect what this body means when it says peace." He said it without emphasis, without inflection, without the rising pitch of a man making a speech. The cadence of a man who had spent 22 years listening to people shout and had learned that the sentence which mattered was the one delivered after the room went quiet. And the room went quiet. Not the institutional quiet of a body processing information between agenda items, a different kind. The quiet of people looking at a man standing alone at a rail that had no seat, charged with being effective, in a chamber full of the people he had been effective for, and recognizing species by species, delegate by delegate, correspondent by correspondent, that the proceeding had become its own evidence. That the charge of disrupting the peace process was being heard in a room full of the peace he had made, and the parties were present, and they had not been asked to come, and they were not leaving. The Disari arbiter at the end of the bench spoke. His voice was deep, unhurried. "Arbiter Chelon, I request that the tribunal formally note the presence of settlement parties in the observer gallery and enter their attendance into the permanent record." Chelon's gray hands tightened on the bench surface. "That is not standard procedure. Article 44 of the Tribunal Charter permits the recording of observer attendance when it is materially relevant to the proceedings. The attendance of parties whose settlements are the subject of this tribunal is materially relevant. I would note that Article 44 does not require the presiding arbiter's consent. It requires only a request from a sitting member." A pause. Chelon looked at the tiers, at the Keithrani, the Disari, the Oreshans. The retired arbiters, who were watching him with the careful, steady attention of former colleagues who knew the procedural manual from memory and could tell, at this distance, whether a rule was being applied or being bent. "The attendance will be noted," Chelon said. The session record now listed by name and delegation every party that had come to Tribunal Chamber 9 because a man who had resolved their disputes was being charged with resolving their disputes. The record was permanent. It could not be sealed without sealing their names with it. The weight of the room shifted. Not visibly, there was no movement, no murmur, no restlessness in the tiers, but the quality of the attention changed. The arbiters at the bench had been performing judgment. They were now being judged, and the shift was legible in the way that Chelon held his pen, not writing, not resting it, but gripping it with the unconscious intensity of a man who has realized that the instrument in his hand is recording a document that will be read by people. he did not expect to read it. A Tavrathi arbiter near the center of the bench cleared his throat, a gesture that, in Tavrathi body language, signified the desire to speak without the conviction that speaking would improve the situation. He did not speak. The Keithrani arbiter beside him had turned her scaled head fractionally toward the observer tiers, taking inventory of the delegations present with the slow, deliberate attention of a species that processed visual information more carefully than most and forgot none of it. In the upper gallery, the retired Tavrathi arbiters had not moved. They sat with the absolute stillness of people who had been in that chamber hundreds of times before, who knew every procedural inflection, every architectural pressure, every way the dome light fell on the bench at different hours of the morning, and who understood exactly what they were watching. One of them had placed a hand flat on the gallery rail, a gesture I had never seen from a Tavrathi outside of formal testimony, where it signified the weight of witnessed truth. At 11:40, a clerk from the conference's administrative office entered through the side door. Her posture carried the compressed formality of someone delivering a document she wished she were not carrying. She walked to the bench with measured steps and placed a sealed folder before Chelon. He broke the seal. He read. His gray hands stilled on the folder's edge, the particular stillness of an administrator absorbing information that restructured the landscape he had been governing. The folder passed down the bench, arbiter to arbiter, each reading, each going still. The Disari and Keithrani delegations had filed joint objections to the reopening of their settled disputes, formal, binding, citing the conference's own arbitration protocols, which required both parties' consent before a settled case could be reopened for procedural review. Consent had not been sought. Consent was not given. The settlement stood. The objections had been filed simultaneously, 1 hour before the tribunal convened, coordinated, prepared in advance. The parties Rourke had brought to agreement were now using the conference's own procedures to protect the agreements he had brokered. They had not been asked. They had not needed to be asked. They had read the charges, understood what was being dismantled and why, and responded with the one instrument the conference could not procedurally override: their own documented consent, exercised through the mechanisms the conference had written into its own charter, because the designers had understood that consent, once formally given, could not be administratively withdrawn. The chamber absorbed the information the way water absorbs a stone, silently, completely, with a shift in level that was visible only to those watching the surface. The Tavrathi arbiter who had cleared his throat earlier set his pen down on the bench surface with deliberate precision, as though the pen had become an instrument he was no longer certain how to use. The Keithrani arbiter's scaled hands, which had been folded in the formal rest position throughout the proceeding, separated and moved to the bench edge. In the observer tiers, the Disari Trade Commissioner's posture shifted, all 4 arms moving simultaneously in the complex Disari gesture that I had learned, over 9 years on the station, signified the confirmation of something already known. The Keithrani representatives did not move. Their stillness was the loudest thing in the chamber. The Orishan attache's recording tablet caught the dome light as she angled it toward the bench, capturing the moment in whatever format Orishan archival practice prescribed. The retired Tavrathi arbiters in the back row exchanged a single glance. In 9 years on the station, I had never seen 2 Tavrathi communicate with a glance. They communicated through procedure, through documentation, through formal channels and structured language. A glance was, for a Tavrathi, an act of startling intimacy, the acknowledgement of a shared understanding too immediate for procedure to contain. Chelon set the folder down. He looked at Rourke. Rourke looked back, stone neutral, hands clasped behind his back, standing because the conference had not permitted him to sit. The 7 arbiters conferred in low voices. The Disari arbiter spoke. A Keithrani arbiter spoke. Chelon listened. The light through the dome had shifted as the Veshan sun tracked higher, and the warm shafts that had been falling on the observer tiers now illuminated the bench itself. 7 faces, 5 species, the pale composite surface of the elevated desk, the sealed folder, and the man at the rail below them who had resolved 3 disputes and was now watching a 4th resolve itself around the people who had tried to prevent it. 4 minutes of conference. In those 4 minutes, the chamber held the particular suspended quality of a room in which the outcome has been determined, but the announcement has not yet been made. The interval between the verdict and the reading, during which the architecture seems to hold its breath. Chelon straightened, hands flat on the bench. The tribunal will render its findings in closed session. The proceedings are adjourned. The chamber stirred. Press correspondents recorded the adjournment. Observers began to rise, but Rourke had not moved. He stood at the rail, hands clasped, looking up at the bench with the steady patience of a man who has said what he came to say and is waiting for the building to finish settling around it. When, one word, delivered without emphasis. Chelon regarded him for 7 seconds, long enough for the chamber to notice the silence. The tribunal's findings will be delivered before the end of the day. And the settlements? The settlements are not within the tribunal's jurisdiction. The parties' objections have been noted. Rourke nodded, a single precise inclination of the head. Not gratitude, not victory, acknowledgement, the nod of a man who had asked a question and received the answer the room required. He stepped back from the rail. He walked toward the exit. He did not hurry. He did not speak to the delegates who watched him pass, the Keithrani representative who inclined her head as he approached, the Disari trade commissioner whose 4 arms unfolded in the formal gesture of a debt witnessed and recorded. He walked with the steady, unhurried gait of a man who had spent his life walking into rooms full of people who did not agree with each other and walking out after they did. I followed him into the corridor, the observation alcove. He was standing at the window looking at the Veshan sky, hands in his pockets. The escort vessels were still there, angular and dark against the bright atmosphere. What happens now? They drop the charges. They have to. The settlements are locked. The record is public. The room was full of the people who signed the agreements they were trying to void. The institutional math doesn't work anymore. And if they don't? He turned. For the first time that day, something moved behind the stone expression, not a smile, not triumph, but something quieter and harder to name. The particular steadiness of a man who had been mocked and charged and made to stand for 4 hours in a room that would not give him a chair, and who understood that the standing was the point. That the conference had wanted him small and supplicant and procedurally erased, and he had stood in their chamber in his too tight suit and answered their charges with the names of the people he had helped, and those people had come without being asked, and the record was permanent, and the building would have to live with what it had heard. Then I'll be back tomorrow, he said, and the room will be full again, and the day after that. The thing about a peace conference is that it only works if the people in the room want peace. They do. The delegates want it. The parties want it. The staff want it. The only people who don't want it are the ones who have built their careers on the process of wanting it. And a process is not a purpose, and eventually the room figures that out. He took the cup of water from the ledge, finished it, set the empty cup down on the sill with the careful precision of a man who sets things down where they belong. I'm going to get lunch, he said. The delegates' dining facility reinstated my reservation this morning. Someone Disari, I think, filed a procedural objection to the reservation's removal while I was standing at the rail. My access was restored before the first recess. He walked down the corridor toward the dining level, steady pace, shoulders squared. The too tight charcoal suit slightly rumpled from 4 hours of standing, the close-cropped gray-black hair catching the corridor's ambient light, the watch on his wrist a plain analog piece. The kind a man wears because it tells the time and does not require explanation, still ticking. The tribunal's findings were delivered at 16:00 that afternoon. All 3 charges dismissed. The dismissal was filed in the conference's permanent record. Rourke's delegate status reinstated effective immediately, with full committee access restored. The settlements in cases 4471, 4472, and 4473 were confirmed as final and binding. The findings were unsigned. The conference's procedural rules permitted unsigned findings when the tribunal wished to attribute its conclusions to the body, rather than to individual arbiters. The format was typically reserved for unanimous decisions. It was also the format used when individual arbiters did not wish their names attached to a decision that reversed the position of the senior coordinating committee that would evaluate their next appointment. I did not share this observation with Rourke. He would not have been interested. Process for Rourke was a tool. You used it to get to the thing that mattered. The thing that mattered was the people in the room, and whether when they left the problem they had brought with them was smaller than when they arrived. The conference's official transcript was sealed by the arbiter's office at 90 minutes after the findings were delivered. The sealed version omitted the observer manifest, the Disari arbiter's request to record attendance, the passage in which Rourke described the subcommittee's 12-year resolution rate, and the 7-second silence before Chelon answered the question, when? It did not omit the charges. It did not omit the dismissals. Some things, even a sealed transcript cannot remove without removing itself. I am filing this account with the Terran delegation's independent archive because the conference's record is incomplete, and because I was asked to be in the room and write it down, and because a sealed transcript is not the same thing as a settled fact. Rourke returned to the subcommittee on resource allocation disputes the following morning. He settled his 4th case within a week. 3 more followed in the quarter after that. Each settlement was entered into the conference's public record with both parties' signatures, and in one case, the unprompted addendum of a Keith Ronnie elder who wrote, in the margin of the agreement form, a single phrase that the translation matrix rendered as, "the man who listens." I asked him once, months later, whether he had been afraid standing at the rail, charged with doing the job he had been sent to do, in a chamber that would not let him sit down. He thought about it for a moment, the same unhurried processing, the same steady cadence, the same stone-neutral expression that was not calm and not defiance, but something between the two that I had never quite found the word for. "No," he said, "I was standing, that's all. You can do a great deal of standing." That was all he said about it. I wrote it down.